Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I am back to talking about Agatha Christie murderers, and this time picking out the worst mistakes made by some of them. And by worst, I mean the most illogical, unnecessary, easily avoidable, stupid mistakes they made that eventually led to them getting caught. Originally, I conceived this idea in the vein of like how every Agatha Christie murderer could have gotten away with it, which is an idea I might still do in the future. These are mistakes that essentially gave the culprit away. This should go without saying here, but there are spoilers ahead. It's unavoidable, but you can check out the chapter titles to skip over the books you don't want spoiled. And before I begin, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel to keep up to date and help the channel grow. My short list contained 26 fatal mistakes, but I'm not doing an honorable mentions list here because I don't want to spoil those other books. So I'll just start out here at number 15 with the mistake from Death on the Nile by Simon Doyle, one of Christie's more idiotic murderers. And that's when Louise catches him running around the boat when he's supposed to be incapacitated. Simon makes a lot of dumb decisions, but I narrowed the list down to just this one. Otherwise, he'd probably have like three or four entries. I chose this one because if Simon isn't caught, I think he and Jackie get away with it if all else remains the same, or at least have a very good chance of getting away with it. This isn't like Simon saving Lynette from being crushed by the boulder. This was a murder well planned out by Jackie and Simon. They took so many precautions to avoid getting caught, so it is odd they didn't take into consideration Louise, who was Lynette's maid and is a person who very obviously may have been in the area, even though her cabin wasn't nearby. And this is a mistake by omission. They simply forget about her when they could have easily dispatched her for the night, like they did with like Poirot and other people. It's a mistake born out of neglect and one that was avoidable. Now, I don't have this one any higher because, well, I feel like as if there was something Simon and Jackie could have done about it. It's not totally unavoidable. Now, Jackie also makes the same mistake later on in the book when she goes to murder Louise, but I don't have that one on the list because that was a spontaneous action. This one was planned out and they could have tried harder to avoid it, so I have it here at number 15. Number 14 is a mistake I debated over whether or not it should be included, as it's not necessarily a mistake made involving the murder directly, either during or afterward, but I did decide it was a large enough error to include it, and it comes from a murder is announced, and it's Miss Blacklock inviting Dora Bunner to come live with her. I mean, Miss Marple even points this out directly. This is a prime example of Christie's frequent criticism about people being too emotional in their decision making. Charlotte Blacklock was lonely, and Bunny was desperate for financial security and friendship. The problem here is that Charlotte trusted Bunny too much. Now, most of this was unavoidable as Bunny recognized Charlotte and not Letitia, but I do think Charlotte gave away too much information to Bunny, who is just so obviously unreliable. Bunny keeps spilling secrets about like the lamps and what Miss Blacklock was holding when the lights went out, and all of these other things that leads to Charlotte into eventually having to murder Bunny, which is an emotional strain she cannot handle, and that leads her to lower her guard. I've always found Miss Blacklock to be a rather sloppy murderer who makes a lot of blunders, with this one being the main reason for her downfall. If Charlotte never invited Bunny to live with her, I think Miss Marple's job gets a lot tougher. Now, I do think she eventually would get there because of the Miss Murgatroyd situation, which is the main reason why I don't have this mistake higher. I do think Miss Blacklock eventually gets caught. I also think it's one of the more understandable and unpredictable mistakes to make, so I have it at number 14. Number 13, another mistake I can understand, and it comes from The Pale Horse, with Zachariah Osborne continuing with his accusations against Mr. Venables. Osborne claimed he saw Mr. Venables walking around the area when Father Gorman was murdered. The problem is that Mr. Venables is in a wheelchair and cannot walk. Even when this is pointed out to Osborne, he still digs his heels in, and All this does is make him more suspicious. He kept incriminating someone who was so obviously innocent and couldn't have done it, which means either one of two things. Osborne somehow knows Venables is guilty via some inside information, or that Venables is innocent and Osborne is guilty. Either way, Osborne exposes himself here. An innocent person would admit the mistake and move on. Now, I do understand why Osborne continues with this line, and it's because he put all of his eggs in that basket, not realizing that Venables was disabled. He essentially had no choice because of just how hard he pushed this in the first place. It really would have been more suspicious if he abandoned it, but I mean, again, he shouldn't have done this in the first place without doing his due diligence, but it is part of his undoing, so I have it here at number 13. At number 12, and this is the last one on the list that has like a plausible excuse, in my opinion, and it comes from Sad Cypress, and it's Nurse Hopkins talking too much, with this being the first of three entries of murderers talking too much to make the list. Poirot often says he can just sit back and listen to suspects talk because people reveal too much in conversation, and it's insanely helpful. And that's what happens here. And Nurse Hopkins provides Poirot with several info dumps about Mary Gerard's birth, which is information Poirot and the reader need to solve the case. The problem is that there's absolutely no reason for Nurse Hopkins to be telling him this information. I've been very critical of this book's many plot holes, and this is yet another one. It is so much more opportune for Nurse Hopkins to just keep her mouth shut about this until Eleanor is convicted and executed. It's a long, convoluted story, but essentially, Nurse Hopkins stands to inherit a large estate from Mary Gerard via her mother, who was secretly Laura Wellman. And I chalk this one up to Christie making a number of errors. I mean, she doesn't really feel like she's really writing this mystery very well, in my opinion. And this, to me, again, is a rare, not well written book from Christie, and Nurse Hopkins doing all this just makes no sense whatsoever. All she does is shine a light on who Mary left her money to, which is Nurse Hopkins. Although, I mean, I guess she probably thinks she's safe behind her alias, but there's still no reason for her to tell Poirot all of this, other than Christie needs a way for this information to come out. And Eleanor is already on trial, and it's not going well for her. So it's not like if Nurse Hopkins needs to push things in this direction. So I have her here at number 12. Number 11, we have an error from another murderer who isn't the brightest, and that is Gerda Christo actively ruining her family's plans to protect her in the Hollow. And if you need a refresher, Gerda shot her husband John, and John's family conspired to protect Gerda because that was his final wish. And this plot does work for a while. I mean, Poirot is fooled by their plot for most of the book. Now, he does eventually catch on to them, so I don't think Gerda gets away with anything, but John's family and friends shield her even to the point of incriminating themselves. And Gerda is in pretty decent position to get away with it until she turns on Henrietta. And she tries to murder Henrietta when the latter comes to take away the holster, which is the final piece of incriminating evidence. Instead of just handing it over or destroying it, she tries to kill her and eventually winds up killing herself. I mean, the issue for Gerda wasn't a conviction, as Poirot has no evidence against her, but the risk is that Poirot knows anyway. And if Gerda had just trusted the Angotels more, she would have gotten away with her crime and wouldn't have had to commit suicide or death by accident, as I sort of implied. But she doesn't, so she comes in here at number 11. At number 10, we have another example of someone talking too much, and it comes from The Body in the Library, with mostly Mark Gaskell making a number of statements he shouldn't have. I find this one more egregious than the one in Sad Cypress and the others because of the situation here. I mean, Mark and Josie know they've committed a body swap. The body believed to be Ruby Keene is actually Pamela Reeves, and vice versa. So it's particularly dumb of Mark to talk about Ruby's physical appearance. It's a topic he should avoid talking about. He mentions her teeth running down her throat while her body has buck teeth. And Josie mentions the clipped nails, but the body's nails are bitten. All this talk does is draw attention to extremely incriminating clues that both Mark and Josie should have been aware they needed to avoid. But they don't, so I have them here at number 10. At number 9 is the first entry from the only book with two items on this list, but from Murder at the Vicarage, I have Anne Prothero using Miss Marple for her alibi. A classic mistake here to underestimate Miss Marple. Specifically, what Mrs. Prothero does is she makes herself seen by Miss Marple wearing a tight dress and no purse, meaning she couldn't have a gun on her person when she entered the vicarage. She deliberately selects Miss Marple for this because she knows Miss Marple recognizes these things and would notice that she didn't have a purse and will tell the police that Mrs. Prothero couldn't have shot her husband because she couldn't have had a gun on her. But she underestimates Miss Marple massively because she fails to realize that Miss Marple would make the further deduction and realize that it's very odd Mrs. Prothero doesn't have a purse on her. And Miss Marple also notices that Mrs. Prothero clearly wanted to be known she didn't have a purse on her. I mean, she makes the crucial mistake of underestimating Miss Marple. And what's particularly bad for her is that Mrs. Prothero knows Miss Marple and knows Miss Marple is this like shrewd figure who isn't easily deceived and will see through, people's personas like that. I mean, she should have known better, so her mistake comes in at number 9. Number 8, another mistake made out of emotion, and it comes from the moving finger when Mr. Symington doesn't send a letter to Elsie Holland, whom he is in love with. And this is a really very telling mistake here because almost everyone in Limstock received a letter, so naturally the attention is going to be on whoever didn't receive a letter, either as a suspect or for some other reason. And because Elsie Holland is one of the few people who never receives that letter, at least from the original Poison Pen letter, there is that side plot with Amy Griffin, but that's not really a factor here. And it puts all the attention on her, exactly where Mr. Symington was trying to avoid. What Mr. Symington should have done was written a Poison Pen letter to Elsie, never sent it, and then presented to the police saying, like, he intercepted it in the mail or whatever. Because by not sending a letter to Elsie, everyone is going to look at Elsie and determine that either she is the letter writer, which they'll find unlikely, or the letter writer didn't want her to harm her. And everyone knows Mr. Symington is infatuated with his children's nanny. I mean, it's a tale as old as time, and this is a mistake born out of emotion and short sightedness, so I have it here at number 8. At number 7, and these top 7, I think, are like the truly elite 7 mistakes made by Christie killers. There was no excuse for them, and they're all massive mistakes as well. The best of these, I suppose you could call it, is from A Caribbean Mystery when Tim Kendall murders the wrong person in killing Lucky Dyson instead of his wife, Molly. And I would even extend this mistake to murdering anyone after Victoria Johnson. I mean, the plot of this book is that Tim wants to murder his wife, Molly, collect an inheritance so he can then marry Esther, who also has a large incoming inheritance. But Tim is forced to murder Major Palgrave, who recognizes him from his previous successes at this scheme, and then also Victoria Johnson, who was blackmailing him. At this point, Tim should have taken a break. There are police everywhere, Miss Marple is snooping around, and most crucially, there is no immediate need for him to do this. The idea is that Tim needs to marry Esther before Jason Raphael dies, but I mean, I really don't understand why. He could just marry Esther afterwards and still get the money, nor is there any indication that Mr. Raphael is actually dying soon anyway, and nor is there any indication he intends to murder Mr. Raphael. I just think this, with the heightened police presence, he shouldn't have been so active in his plans to murder Molly, and he murders the wrong person anyway, which I don't even understand how that happened. Like, I know it says he doesn't recognize Dicey isn't his wife, because it's like dark out and they have the same hair color, but I mean, it's not totally convincing. I mean, this is his wife. Like, how does he not recognize this woman is not his wife? But very sloppy murderer who I have here at number 7. Number 6 is the other mistake from Murder at the Vicarage, and it's done by the book's other culprit, Lawrence Redding, who brings Miss Marple the wrong stone for her garden. And this doesn't sound as damaging as it appears, but Lawrence is an artist who should know which rocks would go with Miss Marple's garden. And to be fair, this is a lie he comes up with on the spur of the moment when Miss Marple catches him with this rock, and with the rock being the one that shot off the firework to create the false gunshot sound. But this is astronomically bad because it ends all hope of him getting away with it. I mean, Miss Marple knows Lawrence Redding must be involved with the murder because she knows he knows that Rock played a part in the murder and does not make sense why he would be bringing her this wrong rock for her garden. And it's a little work after that for her to finish him off. It's such an avoidable mistake and an unconvincing lie from someone who should have known better. So I have it at number 6. Number five, and I think the gravity of this mistake is probably the most fatal one of any Christie killer, but it is one that I think is sort of out of this person's control, and it is this high just because of just how fatal this mistake is. And it comes from Lord Edgware dies, and it's Jane Wilkinson's mix up over the Paris the city and Paris the mythological hero. This mistake was originally at like number one or two, and I did lower it because it is something, like I said, is sort of out of Jane's control. When Jane sent Carlotta Adams in character as Jane Wilkinson to the dinner party to establish her alibi, Carla talked at length about Paris of Troy, the mythological hero. However, when Jane Wilkinson later meets up with the actor Donald Ross, he brings up Paris once again, and Jane Wilkinson has just no idea what he's talking about and thinks the fall of Paris refers to the fall of like Paris, France, and this is just a colossal error. Now Jane has to murder Donald because he knows the first Jane Wilkinson was not Jane Wilkinson. And Jane in general just handles this very poorly. I mean, this is a very public, massive blunder that she cannot recover from. And Donald had already like hinted to Poirot about the Paris situation, and this Paris blunder essentially seals her fate. There's no other logical way out for her. And I will say, I think it's pretty bad Jane didn't know her classics. Certainly, a woman like her was educated in the classics. I mean, if Carlotta Adams was, certainly Jane Wilkinson was. But again, I didn't place this higher because it is an unforeseen circumstance that Jane Wilkinson couldn't control. So I have this blunder here at number five. Number four is a pretty damning mistake, though not as idiotic as the top three. And this one comes from after the funeral when Miss Gilchrist talks about the wax flowers at Enderby Hall. This being like the highest ranked of the one of the killer who talked too much, and Miss Gilchrist pretended to be her employer Cora Lansquenet at Cora's brother's funeral. During the course of the novel, a vase of wax flowers broke and was discarded. Then, at the end of the novel, everyone, including Miss Gilchrist, assembles at Enderby Hall, where Miss Gilchrist makes a comment about how the green malachite table looked better with the wax flowers on them. The problem is that this is Miss Gilchrist's supposed first time at Enderby Hall, so she shouldn't have known about the wax flowers because they aren't there by this time. This means that Miss Gilchrist had to be at Enderby Hall at some previous time, and the only time that could have happened was at the funeral when Miss Gilchrist had to be disguised as someone else. The only person that could be is Cora. And I always found this particularly dumb as a mistake because Miss Gilchrist makes this comment totally unprompted and when she should have been on guard. But she's another classic example of the murderer talking too much. I find this one particularly avoidable. I actually think she has a good chance of getting away with it if she doesn't make this mistake. I mean, there is that like incident with Helen in the mirror and all that, but I mean, this is really what does her in. So she does come in here at number four. Number three is a mistake from a murderer who isn't too good at what they do. And I think this is a mistake that like doesn't get talked a lot about. And it comes from dumb witness when Bella Tanios basically announces her presence as she sets her first trap for Aunt Emily. Not only is this trap with the tripwire like just a particularly bad one and prone to go wrong, Bella decided that she should set it up in close proximity to everyone else where she easily could have been seen. But her real mistake is going into Miss Lawson's room during this time to complain about Bob, the dog, to which Miss Lawson actually sees her and her distinctive clothing. Bella only goes as far as she does in this book without suspicion because Miss Lawson was looking in the mirror, so the TA or the AT brooch actually appeared to be TA. And this is just such an incredibly dumb mistake to announce your presence to someone while you're in the midst of laying a secret trap. And we can get into how bad this trap is, but that's really a different item. And Bella Tanios is one of the sloppier killers out there, and her biggest mistake comes in here at number three. At number two, and I did consider putting this one lower because I think it more comes from Christie's not so tidy writing than as an intentional mistake she has her killer make. And it comes from The Mysterious Affair at Styles, when we learn that Evelyn Howard wrote a letter to Alfred detailing their crimes, motive, and love. And this feels more like Christie needed concrete proof to incriminate Alfred and Evie. This is her first novel, and it does give off very strong, like, first novel jitters. You can tell Christie hasn't perfected her craft in this one. I don't think she would write conspirators communicating in such an incriminating manner, even just like a couple years later into her career. Evie Howard sends Alfred a letter that basically details all of their crimes, how they did it, and their secret love for each other. And just an astronomically dumb thing to do, considering the house is under constant surveillance. This feels like an amateur mistake. And on top of this, Alfred keeps this letter for months. Months. He keeps an extremely incriminating letter for no reason whatsoever. And he hides this letter in a vase that everyone had access to. Now, he does rip it up. Like, I don't understand why he didn't burn this. Did neither of these people like realize how dumb this letter was? It just baffles me to no end. And I have this letter here at number 2. At number 1, the worst mistake made by an Agatha Christie killer is the mistake that inspired this video, and it comes from Death in the Clouds, when Norman Gale blurts out that he wore gloves when he inserted the poison dart into Madame de Giselle. And to me, this one is just so avoidable. It amounts to an unintentional confession. This mistake happened toward the very end of the book in Poirot's summation gathering. And this is a proper summation gathering, one designed to trick the villain. But Poirot lays out his case against Norman Gale and pulls a very obvious bluff by saying Gale's fingerprints were on the poisoned dart. But then Norman counters and says that's impossible because he wore gloves when he did it. And to me, this was just such an unforced fatal error. And Poirot was setting an obvious trap the normally on guard Norman Gale fell for with little thought or consideration. And Gale almost certainly gets away with his crimes had he not admitted this. While Poirot knew the truth, the evidence was so scant he wouldn't have been brought up on charges. To me, this is bad because Gale was smart enough that he should have seen this trap being set up right before him. There wasn't even like a lot of pressure or stress put on him, nor is he the type of murderer who crumbles under pressure. I have no idea how this happened or how Gale wasn't on guard, so I find this to be the dumbest mistake made by a Christie killer here at number 1. And that is it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you think the worst mistake made by a Christie killer is, whether it's one in this video or one I left off. And make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with this channel. Next week, I begin my two-part ranking of every Albert Campion novel written by Marjorie Allingham, so stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.